a high school in Japan, a girl is the center of attention wherever she goes. After everyone stops to admire her beauty, it is revealed that her name is Elisa Kujo, and besides being the daughter of a Russian father, she has the best grades in the school. She starts walking, and a boy appears, greeting her. She replies with a good morning, and he says they should get to know each other. He introduces himself as Ando, a second-year student, and says that his sister had told him many things about her and that he was interested in getting to know her. When he was about to ask her out, she rejects him immediately. After sensing her coldness, he asks if at least they could exchange numbers. She says she will decline because she has no interest in him at all. The boy is left embarrassed, serves him right for being so forward. After dismissing him, she says she has one last thing to mention, that his necklace is against school rules since she is part of the student council. After leaving him speechless, everyone is amazed since she rejected the most sought-after guy in school as if it was nothing. Finally arriving at her classroom, she finds several boys staring at her. Seeing her friend Q sleeping, she greets him. When he continues to sleep, she kicks his chair to wake him up. She greets him again and asks if he stayed up late watching anime again. She says he never learns and that he shouldn't sacrifice a good night's sleep for anime. He says the episode ended late, and he spent 2 hours discussing it with an otaku friend. She asks if he's an idiot, and he says if being an idiot means showing love for an anime he likes without caring about the time, then he accepts the label. She corrects herself and says he's an idiot without salvation. As he yawns from exhaustion, she says something in Russian to him. He asks what she said, and she replies that she called him pathetic. He starts searching under his desk but finds nothing. He asks if she can share her chemistry notes with him. She asks if he forgot again, and he says he left them at home. She says it's okay, and he thanks her. As class continues, Q's is exhausted. The teacher starts writing on the board, and the Russian girl throws a pen at him to wake him up. But unfortunately, he had his hand raised, and the teacher had just asked a question. The teacher tells him to answer quickly. He stands up and asks what question they were on. Looking to the side, she points to him and he says the answer is option 2. The teacher says that's wrong. He asks the Russian girl and she says the correct answer was option 8. Realizing she made him get it wrong on purpose, the teacher tells him to pay more attention in class. He tells her not to give him the wrong answer, and she says she only pointed to the question they were on. He says she's lying and that she clearly pointed to number 2, and she says he's mistaken. She smiles at him and he asks what that smile means. She calls him cute, but in Russian. He gets embarrassed and asks what she said, and she says she called him an idiot. He starts recalling that time when she clearly called him cute. He wonders why she calls him cute and understands perfectly what she's saying. She continues speaking in Russian, making another compliment to him. He gets flustered and wonders why she's calling him that. What she doesn't know is that in his childhood he had a friend who spoke Russian, and by spending time with her, he naturally learned to speak the language back then. He starts wondering why such a beautiful Russian girl is flattering him, and even if it's in Russian, he understands everything. He thinks that if he admits he understands her, she might faint, but to avoid any problems, he prefers to keep it a secret. The scene cuts and he decides to take out his phone. She tells him that phones are not allowed in class unless it's an emergency, and he says that in this case it is an emergency. She looks worried and asks what kind of emergency it is. He replies that he only has 10 minutes to unlock a new character for free. She says he's quite bold to do that next to a student council representative, while he celebrates having unlocked the SSR Tsukuyumi. She confiscates his phone to take a look. She asks if this Tsukuyumi is the moon goddess in Japanese mythology, and why her hair is silver instead of black. He says it might be a reference to the moon and that he doesn't care about the details because he thinks she's very beautiful. She gets annoyed and returns his phone. She says in Russian that she also has silver hair and that he's betraying her. Realizing what she's saying, he becomes embarrassed. He asks what she said, and she says she called him a game addict. He pretends not to understand and says she's insulting him. He says she can't call him an addict and that he's just a casual gamer. She says she thought he was a more serious boy. He says being serious is his middle name, and she says that's the exaggeration of the century. He replies that they still have at least another 80 years ahead. The scene cuts to break time, and he starts shouting that he wants to be popular with girls. They look at the Russian girl and her sister, who is the student council secretary, accompanied by Suu, the council spokesperson. One of the boys says that Kujo-senpai is very beautiful and that he wants to get closer to her. Another boy says he heard she already has a boyfriend, and Q says she always rejects boys by saying she's already dating someone, and with or without a boyfriend, he wouldn't stand a chance. The boy gets upset, telling him not to be so smug just because he's friends with the Russian girl and that he's jealous because he can call her by her nickname. Q's admits it's true, but she always seems disappointed in him. The boy says it's not so bad since she doesn't talk to anyone else but him. The boy says if he doesn't have a chance with one, he'll try his luck with the other, who is friendlier than the Russian girl. While they talk about the girls look for a place to sit. Seeing Q's sitting there, the Russian girl approaches and asks if she can sit with him. He says she can make herself comfortable and asks if it's okay with the other boys, who say it's fine. She seems impressed that both of them chose to eat instant noodles, and the Russian girl doesn't like it at all. She says it tastes good but thinks it should be a bit spicier. He agrees with her, and she says maybe she'll bring this up with the council. He tells her she shouldn't bring her preferences to the council. The Russian girl, feeling jealous, asks if they are friends. She says they've been friends since they were kids. The Russian girl is impressed, and he asks if they get along well. She says they are becoming good friends, at least that's what she wants. She says maybe it wouldn't be fun to be her friend, but the other girl insists they would be good friends. The excited boy stands up and says he's finished eating, and they say they are leaving. He says the girls shine too brightly, and he can't handle it. The Russian girl moves a bit closer to him and nearly chokes. She asks if he'll accept her offer to join the council, and he says, as he has said many times, he's not interested. She says he would fit perfectly with them since he has experience as vice president. The Russian girl doesn't understand, and the other girl explains that when they were younger, she was the president and he was the vice president. He says he only accepted because she kept insisting. She says it might surprise her, but even though it didn't seem like it, he was good at it. He feels embarrassed, and she says in Russian that she believes in his potential too. The scene cuts, and the Russian girl asks if they were close. He asks if she's surprised, and she says very much, as she didn't imagine he had a friend. He says that he does have one, and she's right in front of him. She asks if they are friends, and he says he thought so. She agrees and says they are friends. He asks where she's going, and she says she remembered something she needs to take care of and walks away excitedly. Suddenly, there's a flashback of Q's with his childhood Russian friend. She calls him pineapple, and he corrects her, saying it's Masachika. She corrects herself and asks him to sit next to her. She starts speaking in Russian, saying the sky is beautiful. He tries to respond but stumbles over the words, and she corrects him. As it gets dark, he says goodbye to her. He wakes up and says he studied Russian just to talk to her but can't even remember her name. Morning arrives and no one has arrived yet. He starts organizing the classroom and says now it's perfect. The Russian girl arrives and he greets her. He says he woke up early to tidy up the mess. She sarcastically asks if he really woke up early. Then it must be going to rain today. He notices a black stain on her sock and asks if she stepped in a puddle. She says she's not an idiot like him. He asks if she's calling him clumsy. She says she didn't say that. Actually, a truck passed by and splashed water on her. He says those drivers are all reckless, and she says it was her fault for walking so close to the street, but she brought another pair of socks, so it's not a problem. She asks if he really doesn't want to join the student council, and he says he's not really interested. She starts taking off her sock, and Q's gets excited. Realizing he's looking away, she gets an idea. She asks him to get the sock from her locker since she already took off one sock and can't get it herself. He gets impatient and fetches the sock for her. She asks him to put it on, and he is shocked, asking what's gotten into her. She says it's a thank you for getting her sock. And isn't this already a reward for him? He says this would be a reward for thousands of people. She asks if she's wrong, and he says she's right. She says in Russian that for her, this is also a reward. He starts wondering what these shows of interest in Russian mean. He thinks she might be tired of being so perfect and is using him as an escape. She asks what the problem is, and he says he just wants to know what she said. She says she only called him a coward and that she'll put the sock on herself. He says there's no need for that and he'll put it on. She asks what he thinks he's doing, and he says she's the one who asked. She starts to feel shy, and he says she called him a coward, and he won't accept being called that. He starts putting on her sock, and she says she wasn't ready for this. He asks her to stop moving. When he manages to put it on, his hand slips, and she asks what he thinks he's doing and kicks him in the face. He falls backward, and she runs away, embarrassed. Hours later, he runs up to her to apologize. She says in Russian that he's a pervert, and he gets embarrassed. She says she's not angry anymore and that she should apologize for kicking him. She places her hand on his face to see if he's hurt badly, and he says she doesn't need to worry and thanks her for the beautiful view she gave him. She gets angry and asks what he's talking about. She gets embarrassed and asks if he saw something, and he says yes, thanking her for the blessing. She punches him in the face and says in Russian she can't believe it and calls him an idiot. He starts chasing after her, asking for forgiveness. She keeps running away, asking him to stop following her. She jumps over the hallway, and he says that's why she always gets perfect scores in physical education. 10 minutes later, they are both exhausted. He asks if she's okay, and she says she'd be better if he hadn't chased her. He apologizes again, and she says she understands and that it was her fault. He kneels down and hands her a can of ashiruko. She asks what his intention is, and he says to accept it as a peace offering since he knows she loves that drink. She accepts the drink, saying she'll drink it only because she's thirsty. She indirectly asks in Russian if he wants a sip. He is shocked, wondering if this is an indirect kiss and if saying yes means they will indirectly kiss. He asks what she said, and she says she mentioned it's good to drink something sweet after exercising. She speaks in Russian, saying it seems he doesn't understand a word she's saying. He starts to freak out, saying he actually understands, until the next day arrives, and he asks her what she wanted with him. She says it would have been right for him to ask if she had waited too long to be a bit more gentlemanly, and he starts being more polite, albeit ironically. Then the Russian appears and says they got along well. He says he didn't know she was there, and she apologizes if she's interrupting them. For some reason, He gets nervous around her and asks if she wanted his help organizing this mess. She remarks that he seems used to it already, and asks if he could get that board game for her. He hands it to her, noticing there's also a deck of cards, and she mentions they use them at school festivals, and she played them at the student council the other day. He asks who won the game, and the Russian notices they're talking too much and tells them to focus more on their task. She starts saying in Russian that she also wants his attention, and he gets all embarrassed. He starts wondering how she dares to say that. She looks at him and says she's hitting on him, but he had no idea. And she continues singing a needy little song asking for his attention, until some time passes and she thanks him for his help. Then an impressed guy shows up saying they're already done. After finding out that Q's helped with the task, he says he's the council president. He says he's heard a lot about him being very talented. He starts looking at him and says he really looks like a president. When he was about to say goodbye to them, he says he would feel bad if he didn't repay the favor, and in that case he would pay for his dinner. He says he didn't need to, but he thanked him anyway. She says he should accept it. After all, dinner wouldn't be ready when he got home. He asks how she knows something about his house, and she says they were childhood friends, and he says in that case they should all go to dinner together. Until the scene cuts, and they were already at the restaurant. He says he thought they would take until tomorrow to finish. The girl starts praising Q's and says he was amazing. The president says it's not normal for SEUS to compliment people, and if he was interested in joining the council. He turns down the offer and says he's tired of it, and what he did in junior high school was enough. He keeps insisting that he enters, and he says he is not very ambitious. She tells him to join them and that it would be better for him. He says she's practically the right choice to be the next president, and she says she wants to be in the student council with him, and he says he doesn't want to and that it's a lot of work. He says he was wrong in saying that only SEUS was the candidate for president, and that the main one is Kujo. He asks if this was serious, and she says she would be running against SEUS next year, until the waitress appears and says it's time to eat. After filling their bellies, they say goodbye and go their separate ways. He tells them to move forward, and she says he doesn't need to take her home. They start walking, and he asks if she really was going to run for president. She says yes, but the atmosphere gets a little heavy. She says he could leave her right here. Until the scene cuts, and Q's arrives home and comes across a pair of shoes at his door. When he gets home, she asks if he took the Russian home. He asks what she was doing here, and she says she's going to sleep here tonight. She starts talking about the manga she was reading, and how the unknown guy should be the heroine's brother, and how the protagonist doesn't notice. He says look who's talking, especially she who pretends to be his childhood friend. She says it wasn't a lie, and if he knew what a childhood friend was, he says it's someone you got along with as a kid. And she says he was right, and that includes brothers, childhood friend, otaku friend, sister. They can all be true at the same time. She returns to reading the manga and says that the guy with her was the older brother. He says that was classic, and she says that he was kissing her. He asks what the hell that was, and she says it was a masterpiece, and he says maybe they could just be half-brothers or something like that. And she tells him to stop being stupid, and that the manga is only good because the brothers are real, and that confirms that she is indeed his younger sister. Until morning arrives, and the girl sends a good morning to him. Wow, Japanese speaking English and I didn't even know. He says that because of her it wasn't good anymore. She says she was just waking him up with love and affection, and he tells her not to talk as if it were a joke. He says it was VD, and she asks if it was a divine goddess and that he really loved her, and he says it's VD for domestic violence. She says she was running out of options, and that next time, she would hide under the bed to pull his leg. He asks what she was thinking of doing, and after hearing her nonsense, he tells her to get off him. Until afternoon arrives, and the crazy ones had already watched a movie. She says it was great to see the exclusive moments that don't appear on TV, and she tells them to watch it again. He pulls her and says they need to go shopping. While they take a walk in the mall, they start looking at clothes, but she says she wants to buy some anime items. He's amazed to see that it costs 15,000 yen, and she says women's fashion costs per centimeter of fabric. He calls her and asks if it was his impression that there was something silver spying on them, and she says it wasn't just his impression. He says she took the ponytail off and that she was very different. Meanwhile, the Russian was just spying on them. They start talking, and he says he's surprised she noticed before, and she says she has a great sixth sense for detecting close people. He starts wondering what they were going to do now, and when he sees it, his sister had gone to talk to her. She gets all embarrassed and says she just happened to run into them a little while ago. And they say just a moment ago. She asks if she had already had lunch, and she says she hadn't yet. She says that since that's the case, she could go to the restaurant with them, and ask if she was really thinking about taking the Russian to that restaurant. She says he himself was looking forward to it. He says that since they are going with the Russian, they should go somewhere else. She acts tough and asks what the problem was. She asks if she likes spicy food. She starts thinking and she understands what kind of restaurant it would be. His sister says they were going to a place where they served spicy ramen, and since she likes spicy food, she should go with them. He says it wasn't that simple, and that he was going to be honest with her. He says it's an extremely spicy place, but she interrupts him and says she'll go. He tells her she doesn't have to if she doesn't want to, and she asks if he had a problem with her being there. Eventually, he gives in. Then the scene cuts, and they arrive at the spiciest restaurant in town. The Russian girl is shocked and asks why it's called Hell's Cauldron, and if it's not a ramen house. She confirms it is, and wonders why hell is in the name. He says she'd better give up, but she says she was just surprised by the name, that's all. After experiencing the very peculiar restaurant, she says she doesn't know what to order. The girl says the blood pool ramen is the mildest, and the thorny valley feels like your tongue is being pierced by needles. After hesitating about what to order, Q says he'll have the blood pool ramen, and she decides to order the same. His sister says since they're ordering the same thing, she'll have it too. The Russian girl remarks that she's dressed quite masculine today, which surprises her. She says since she's off duty, she decided to change her look a bit. The Russian starts to feel strange, saying she woke up in Q's bed this morning, and everyone was confused. She says she wanted to wear something different, so she borrowed his shirt. She asks what that meant, and he says she showed up at his house without warning, invaded his room, and jumped into his bed without his permission, but it seems she didn't really believe it. Then the waiter appears with the food on the table, and when she looks at the dish, she can feel the heat right away. She starts staring at the dish, and it seems like it's going to be a tough challenge for her. She takes the chopsticks and dives in, and soon regrets it. He asks if she's okay, and she says it's delicious. They both say it's delicious, and she starts speaking in Russian that it hurts. He tells the Russian girl she doesn't have to try so hard, and she says she actually said it was good, but he understood exactly what she meant. She starts asking her mom for help, saying she can't take it anymore. His sister asks what she thought, and she says it was way too delicious. She says since she likes spicy food, she has an idea and suggests using Demon's Tear to spice it up even more. Hughes meets her evil look and realizes she's doing this on purpose. He tells her not to try it, and she says one drop won't kill her. She starts putting pepper on the ramen, gives it a stare, and goes for it, and it seems things are getting really spicy around here. Then the scene cuts and he asks if she's okay, and she asks where Sue is. He says she went to buy some things, and if she's okay. She asks what he means, and he says she knows what he's talking about. He looks to the side and asks if she wants ice cream, and she says she does. They start eating ice cream, and her tongue thanks her. He asks her why she wants to be student council president, and she says because she wants to, and if she needs a reason for that. He asks if she has a running mate. She says no, but it's okay because she doesn't need anyone. He says the rules say you need to run in pairs, and she says in that case she'll find someone random to support her. He starts reflecting, and she says in Russian that it would be nice if he could help her. Q starts having a flashback of a little girl apologizing to her parents because she didn't have her running mate. The flashback ends, and she asks if he has something to do, and he says he's free. She says since that's the case, he should come with her. He asks if she's sure she wants to take a boy to buy clothes with her. She says it makes sense, and he says she doesn't have friends to buy clothes with, so she doesn't know how it works, and he says in that case, he'll help her. She asks what's gotten into him, and he says they're friends. Arriving there, she starts wondering why he's being so nice to her, and if he thinks she's not capable of becoming president. She gets angry and asks if he's making fun of her. She says she's going to change, and asks him what he thinks. She says she's going to surprise him with a fashion show and show who's in charge. She starts thinking and says he's going to end up hearing her changing, and she tells him to step back a bit. She starts changing, and she says she looks beautiful. When she's about to leave, she starts worrying if he didn't have any reaction to seeing her, and that if he does that she's going to kick him in the face. She appears all tough and asks what he thinks. He says she looks great, and she turns all red. He says this outfit enhances her elegance, and that she looks much prettier than usual. She gets all embarrassed and closes the curtain. She starts freaking out, saying he praised her too much. Meanwhile, he was freaking out, saying he was dying of embarrassment, and how she manages to make him feel like that all the time, until some girls appear and say that the young couples are very cute. She couldn't believe he called her beautiful, until she starts thinking, and she says she didn't know he had the courage to compliment a girl like that, and she wonders if he's used to it. She asks what he thought of that outfit, and he says she's more beautiful than cute, and that this style is perfect for her. She gets all shy but tries to pretend she doesn't care. She starts parading for him, asking for his opinion, and it's a new compliment for each different outfit. She says the feeling of being complimented all the time was wonderful. Then she starts looking for what to wear now. She looks at herself in the mirror and says maybe this is too bold, but she's sure Hughes will compliment her. She opens the curtain and asks what he thinks of this, and when she looks, his crazy sister is there. She says she's very bold, and Hughes agrees with her. She gets embarrassed and closes the curtain, and she starts saying in Russian that she wants to die. She asks what she said, and he says she wanted to drag herself, and she says she's very childish. Until the scene cuts, and they were on the subway, and she was in the moon until now, until the subway stops, and he says goodbye to her. She says today was fun, and they should go out together more often. They say goodbye, and she starts wondering what she was thinking of wearing that kind of clothes, and that he'll think she's easy. Until she realizes, and she starts asking why they got off at the same station. Until she arrives later, and she gets home. Her sister shows up and welcomes her. She calls her Masha and says she had arrived. And she says she had already asked to be called Oni-chan here in Japan. They go to the room, and her sister says she looked very down and asks if something had happened. She says she's fine, but her sister says she can't fool her sister. She says it wasn't a big deal, and that she just happened to meet Hughes with her childhood friend. She says she understands and that she gets very irritated when it comes to him. She gets all giddy and says that finally, a boy has appeared who can touch her heart. She plays dumb and asks if she likes him. She says she doesn't know where she got that idea from, but it wasn't what she was thinking. She starts to reflect and says they were just friends. Her sister asks how they became friends. After all, she hates lazy people. She gets embarrassed until we start having a flashback from 6 years ago. The Russian teacher tells them to form groups and write about some shops, and that the best group would receive a prize. Then the scene cuts, and they start deciding which shops they would go to. She says that since they are competing, she had to come in first. She starts walking, and the shopkeeper asks if someone had sent her to buy something, and she says it was a school project, and that they had to research the shops and see what their businesses were. After the flower shop, she went to research the butcher shop, and arriving later, she gets the news that they still hadn't gone to research anything. She asks how so, and that writing a report takes time and they had to do it soon. The guy says there was still a week left and that it would be easy, and she tells him to stop being lazy. He says it's simple. Clothing stores sell clothes, and bakeries sell bread. They look at her notes and ask if she was taking it that seriously. The girl asks if they would really have to read all that. She gets embarrassed and asks why they don't take it more seriously. They start arguing, and the boy says if she thinks it's so bad, she should do it all by herself. After spending days working hard, the day of the final result arrives. After discovering that Group B had won, she is disappointed. She starts walking, saying that if the others had worked hard along with her, they would have made it, and that she was wrong to expect anything from them. She looks at the sky and says that if that's the case, she will do everything by herself. Then the scene cuts, and everyone is wondering how she passed the extremely difficult transfer exam. After the bell rings, she wonders how he managed to sleep with all that noise. She calls him, saying the bell was ringing. He wakes up and asks if she was the student who had transferred to Japan. She says yes and introduces herself as Elisa, saying it was a pleasure to meet him. He says he is Q's Masachika and that the pleasure is all his. Days go by, and she notices he always forgets his book. In physical education classes, the guy seemed like a slug, and in math classes, he only knew how to sleep. She says that apparently lazy people are everywhere. A few months pass, and they start talking about preparations for the end of the year. Until later, she says she will stay working a little longer. The girls leave, saying it was just a school festival. She starts to realize that once again, she was the only one who cared. She ends up pricking her finger and says that won't stop her. And even if she's alone, nothing will hinder her. Then the door opens, and when she looks, it's Q's. He says he figured she would still be here and asks why she didn't go home, and that they would resolve it tomorrow. She says not to worry about her, and that she was going to do this a little longer. He says the club agreed to help them with the costumes, and that this was permission to spend the night at school, and that such a special event would really excite the other students. She asks how he managed that, and he says he asked the former student council president to pull some strings, and the craft club agreed in exchange for the boys' labor. He tells her to go home and that it made no sense for her to work alone. She gets mad and asks what he meant by that. She starts venting, saying she just wanted this attraction to be perfect, and that she wouldn't do something half-hearted. After continuing to vent, she asks if she was doing something wrong. He says she is putting effort into the wrong things, and that school festivals are not meant to be done alone. The goal is for everyone to work together. She was going to argue with him, but she gets embarrassed. He says that maybe this would irritate her. He apologizes and thanks her for her effort. She grabs her bag and says she's leaving. After leaving the room, she starts wondering what his problem was. Then the next day arrives, and they start talking about what the festival would be like and that it would be an explosion of fun. As days go by, everyone is dedicated. The Russian girl starts to understand the magic of group work. After enjoying the day a lot, night finally arrives. She finds Q sitting there. He says maybe the school was indeed strange. After all, who still had a folk dance? She asks to sit with him, and he asks if she wasn't going to dance, and that he was sure everyone wanted to dance with her. He asks if she didn't know how to dance, and she says she practiced ballet a lot when she was a child, and that it was easy for her. But she had refused everyone, saying she couldn't dance because she wasn't interested. He says fighting off the guys must be hard. She says it's fine, and that she's already used to it. And he says it makes sense, after all, she was their ice princess. She asks what he means, and he says that's what everyone's been calling her lately. She starts to think, and he asks if she didn't like it because it was indirectly calling her lonely. She says it wasn't that, and tells him not to make fun of her. He apologizes, and she says what bothers her is the part about being called a princess. He asks if that wasn't a compliment to her, and she says it makes it seem like she's a spoiled brat from a wealthy family. He says maybe it's her impression. She says she was born with above-average looks and talent, but she never managed to be satisfied with that, and that she gets irritated when her efforts are ignored just because of her class. He says it makes sense and that he will avoid calling her that. She thanks him, and he asks what she was thanking him for. She says he was right, and if she had done everything alone, she wouldn't be seeing everyone gathered like this. He tells her to relax, that he just filed some documents, and that he didn't do even half of what she did. She says that even so, it bothers her and that she wanted to repay him somehow. He says he doesn't want anything, and she says he doesn't have permission to refuse. He says that if it's like that, he has an idea. He asks if there isn't a custom in Russian to call people by a special nickname. He starts thinking of a nickname, and she says her family calls her Alya, and he asks if he had permission to call her that. She asks what he would gain from that, and he says he has the glory of being the only guy in school to call her by a nickname. She asks if he is an idiot, and he thanks her. Then some desperate guys show up asking to dance with her. They start arguing over who would dance with her, and she says she didn't want to dance. Suddenly he grabs her hand and tells the guys that she was already busy. He starts pulling her to the middle of the court, and she says it feels like her heart is going to explode. This is too beautiful, man. I think I got something in my eye. He says that since she practices ballet, dancing now would be easy for her. She agrees with him, and he tells her to show her potential, and he calls her princess, and it looks like she liked it. Then the next day arrives, and the guy was sleeping. He says good morning to her and asks why she was looking at him like that. She insults him, and he says she was very aggressive, and she says in Russian that she thought he was very romantic last night. Then the flashback ends, and she says she now understood, and if that was what made them fall in love. She asks if she had paid attention, and she says that clearly is the beginning of a beautiful love story. She gets embarrassed and says they were just friends, and she says it starts like that and that this story is classic. She grabs her necklace and mentions a guy she likes. The Russian girl says she really trusts him, and she says her friend is the same. She starts telling when he saved her from a dog, and she tells her to stop bragging about her love life. Then the scene cuts, and Q's goes to the office. He welcomes him, and he says he just came to help the girl. She asks if he was Q's, and that she was Alya's older sister and student council secretary. He says the Russian girl was a great friend to him, and that he had heard she needed help with some shopping. She says he can call her Masha, and that anyone who is a friend of her sister becomes her friend too. She takes his hand and says it's a pleasure. They start looking at each other, and she asks what his given name is. He says it's Masachika. She is impressed, and the principal asks what the problem is with his name. And he asks if the problem wasn't with his face. She gets a bit sad and says it's nothing, and that she was happy to meet Alya's friend. She speaks in Russian for them to go, and he asks what she said, and she confirms she told them to go. Then the scene cuts, and they had already arrived. She says that this stuffed cat was very cute and looked like her sister. He wasn't liking it at all, and she suggests they buy stuffed animals that look like each person on the council. He says it's a terrible idea, and that the president would feel uncomfortable. She ignores him and continues looking for a bear for the president. And when she sees it, it really looks like the president. He tells her to stop with that idea, and she says she will at least buy this kitty for her. And he tells her to hide that kitty, otherwise the Russian girl would take care of it. After leaving there, he wonders if she's always like that, and if so, Alya must go through a lot. She says that was the place, and he tells her to go, and that he would hold things for her. She tells him to take good care of Alya Nyn, and he gets all embarrassed. She says they look very good together, and he says her tastes were very dubious. When she tries to take a picture of him, he tells her to stop with that. The mustached guy serves her tea, and she thanks him and asks Q's what he thinks. He says he's not a tea expert, and he starts thinking, saying that his sister knows that well, and that their mother had taught her. Suddenly he starts having a memory of his father saying he was going to separate from his mother. He agrees sadly, and says he wants to stay with his father. His sister was sick and says she will stay with her mother. The flashback ends, and he finds her asking if he was okay. He says it was nothing, and she says he seemed hurt. She starts stroking him and saying he would be fine. He asks what relaxing feeling this was, and that it was very familiar. Suddenly he feels warmth, and he says it was burning his back. The cup ends up falling, and it looks like things heated up, until the scene cuts and they had returned from shopping. He asks what she was holding. She asks if he doesn't think it's cute. He says he does, but asks her not to leave it here. She asks if she can't, and he asks her to reconsider. Hughes says these are the purchases they made. The president says it looks like they bought common items and that he had helped a lot, and that God knows how it would have been if she had gone alone. And Hughes says it would have turned into an amusement park. The president gets closer to him and asks if he had decided to join the council. He says no, but that he doesn't mind helping with some basic things. She asks why he doesn't just join officially. The president agrees, and he says he understands Yuki wanting him to join, but why was he so determined about it? He asks why he's so determined not to participate, and that there was more to the story. He says he's not worthy of being a council representative. And the president says he disagrees. After all, he was an excellent vice president in middle school. And he says that experience proved it, and that he never had a proper goal for it. The president asks what the problem was. After all, he became president just to win the heart of a girl, and that this was a more inappropriate reason than any other. He starts laughing and tells him to take a look at this picture. Hughes asks if it was his younger brother, and he says that was him in the 9th grade. Hughes is impressed and says he changed a lot. He says he was like that 2 years ago, and that besides being a terrible student, he hated sports and never liked school much. But after he fell in love with one of the prettiest girls in school, he decided to make an effort to become a worthy man for her. Hughes asks who she was, and he says it was the vice president of the council. He gets embarrassed, and the president says he doesn't need a proper reason to join, and that even she only joined because Chisaki asked. He asks if it's true. She says yes, although she was already interested. She says that it doesn't matter the reason, what's important is what you do while you're here. He asks if that's how it works, and she says that's how it should be, otherwise only saints would occupy the positions. He says she's right, and the president says they can't ignore his results in middle school, and that he has absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. He starts to have a flashback of his sister saying he always needs to be by her side. He says it would be a lot of work, and she says he's her brother. He says if he wants to join the council, he should make someone the president, and that this was already acceptable. He says they will welcome him with open arms. Hughes says he'll think about it, and he says that's the privilege of the young. She says he talks as if he wasn't young too, and that he doesn't look his age. He starts laughing, and Hughes starts thinking, saying he had a strange air of importance. He looks at the chair and asks where Alya was. He says she was resolving a dispute between the baseball and soccer teams. He asks what he means, and he says the baseball team has championships every year at this time. But the soccer team made it to the qualifiers this year, and they were arguing about who would use the field. He asks if the Russian went to try to resolve this situation. He says yes, and that unfortunately no team wants to cooperate. The girl says the baseball captain was featured on TV, and he says he's known as the future. He says usually Chisaki handles club fights, but she's absent because of important matters, and it seems the Russian was having problems. He decides to go there and says he'll just check if there was a fight. Until the scene cuts and the atmosphere was tense. The guy says it's more advantageous to play at home. He says they have these matches every year. He says it's just a stupid friendly match. She tells them to calm down, and that insulting each other wouldn't solve anything. He asks if she had a better idea, and she suggests they use the Riverside Park for practice. The guy complains, and he says there was a baseball field there, and he says there was also a soccer field. While they argued to see who was more important, the two captains were silent. She tries to calm the fight, and she says no one was listening to her. She says she doesn't know how to influence people, and that since that day, she never wanted to trust people and always preferred to do everything alone. She says she always refused to interact with people, and now she was reaping what she sowed. After all, who would listen to someone who only knows how to be arrogant? She starts crying, saying she was completely alone. She starts speaking in Russian, asking for someone to help her. And when you see it, Q's appears, he apologizes for the intrusion, and says the council sent him. Until we are shown a few seconds ago while he was watching everything happen. He says that way she wouldn't succeed, that both were too stressed, and they needed to act differently. He says he feels sorry for her, but this would be a good experience. When he was about to leave, he hears her asking for help. He says that's why she ends up alone because she only says that in a language no one understands, and he says in Russian that he is coming. Until we return to the present, and they ask if he wasn't the vice president of middle school. He says the president had explained a bit to him, and if they wanted to compete to see who would get the field. After the captain confirms, he says he has an idea. He tells the baseball team to train by the riverbank. After all, they have fewer members in their team. And in return, since the soccer team has more people, they send people to help with their training. While the dispute was still going on, Hughes starts looking at a girl. She says the assistants will help the baseball team. The guys get shy and say it will be a good help. The guy asks if they weren't just complaining now. She says they will give up the field, and that helping is the least they can do. The captains decide to agree to the deal, and Hughes says it was resolved. While he was talking to them, the Russian girl got all awkward, until the scene cuts and they start walking. He apologizes for intervening, and that he ended up taking over her speech. She asks why he made that proposal, and that logically the baseball team would never accept it, and that it seemed like he knew the assistant would offer to help. He asks how she noticed, and she says he was looking at her the whole time. He says that assistant is the girlfriend of the baseball team captain. She can't believe it, and he says the whole school already knew they were dating. He says the captain was quiet the whole discussion, and that he wanted to help his girl, but as captain, he had to keep his priorities. And that for her it was strange because she knew it was what her team wanted, and he imagined she would accept the proposal. She asks if they were in the same boat. He says yes, and that because the baseball team has some pretty girls, the soccer team will be able to use the school field, and so they can flirt during training, and that it was 3 birds with 1 stone. They keep walking when suddenly the president asks if they had resolved the problem. He says yes, and she says it was all thanks to Q's. The president says he did a great job, and he asks if he had already planned this. The president gets embarrassed and says it proves he knows what he's talking about. He asks if he changed his mind, and he says that from today he would have the honor of being part of the student council. He is happy with the news, and it seems the Russian girl didn't like it very much, until night falls, and he says he feels he was tricked. He has a flashback of him telling him to bring the form tomorrow. He starts thinking, and she calls him, and he asks what it is, and she asks if he was really going to join the council. He says yes, and she asks if he was doing it to run for the election with Sue. He asks what she would do if the answer was yes, and she says she will become the council president, even if it means having him as a rival. He starts to remember the past and says she was always very determined. He looks at her and says he will make her the president. And if that's what she wants, he won't leave her alone, because he will always be by her side. She gets emotional, and he asks her to hold his hand. She gets all cute, and her eyes fill with tears. She takes his hand, and he says now they are a team. She thanks him and says something in Russian to him. He gets scared, and he asks what that was. He starts to remember his childhood friend, and he wonders if that feeling still existed inside him. She starts squeezing his hand, and he asks what the problem was. She asks if he was thinking about some girl. He asks how she knows. He gets shocked, and says that's the second thing a romantic comedy protagonist can't let slip. She says he just said he would be by her side. He says yes, and she asks if he was thinking about Sue. He says it wasn't her, and she starts squeezing even harder. He gets nervous, and she says he should accept this slap silently if he wants to be forgiven. The guy flies away, and he says it was a nice slap. She calls him an idiot and extends her hand to him, until the scene cuts, and he says this is the first time he gets slapped by a girl, and that he gained more XP as a man. She asks if he hit his head when he fell, and he says his brain was perfectly fine. She says she forgot his brain was defective from the factory. He says that's not something to say to a guy who was considered a child prodigy. And it seems she didn't really believe it, until the scene cuts and she asks how his cheek is, and if he needs ice. He says he's fine, and just doesn't feel anything on the left side of his face. She says that doesn't sound good, and he says he was joking. He says it was throbbing a bit, and she gives him a kiss on the cheek. He is left speechless, and she says it was just a little kiss. He starts to zone out with the sensation. She says goodbye to him and says they will talk tomorrow. He asks how she did that, and he starts shouting for her to tell him what she said in Russian earlier. Until the scene cuts, and we are shown that she said she loved him. She starts wondering if she really loves him. She starts freaking out, saying she doesn't love him at all, and that she just got carried away by the moment. She says maybe she is falling for him, but there was something more important, which is becoming the council president. She says she should be focused on meeting his expectations, and if she confessed her love, he would end up rejecting her. She starts punching the pillow saying she doesn't love him, until her sister arrives, and she asks why she was so serious, and she says she met a wonderful person. She shows the kitten to her, and says the expressions on its face looked like hers. She starts walking and says she found Q's to be a great person, and that it makes sense she fell for him. She says she doesn't like him, and her sister says she looks really cute when hiding her feelings. She gets embarrassed, and her sister tells her to hurry and confess her feelings to him, and that she won't be able to do anything when they take him away from her. She pretends not to understand, and turns her back on her. Meanwhile, the guy was heading home, remembering the things he said to her and thinking he had been very cheesy. He believes she said in Russian that she loved him. He wonders if all her words in Russian were not a joke. Of all the times, this seemed to be the most serious. He thinks that maybe she got carried away by the moment, just like he did, and that she should have already returned to normal and was regretting what she did. He feels a bit sad and starts having a flashback of his mother complaining that he hardly ever stayed home because of work, and that apologizing wouldn't solve things so easily. He reflects that love is a fragile emotion, and that thinking about it is a waste of time. He thinks he wouldn't be able to be by her side. After all, he abandoned his sister and left her to carry on the SEUS family name alone. The scene cuts and he arrives home. He sees her shoes and wonders if she isn't busy today. He thinks that if today's events were planned for him to join the council, she would clearly be involved. Then he opens the door and sees her. She calls him a pervert, and he responds that he knows she set this all up. She asks if he realized it, and he says he bets she left as soon as she heard him close the front door. She pulls him and tells him to wait, asking if he wasn't curious about why she did this. He tells her to put her clothes on first. She says she realized something crazy. She points out that they lived together for years, but they never had the scene of walking in while the other was dressing. He says this is worse than he imagined. She says siblings see each other changing at least once in their lives. He tells her maybe in her manga and to calm her otaku brain. She gets mad and says it was at least worth a picture. He asks where she was looking, and she says it's a camera that only idiots wouldn't see. He gets mad, and she says she will make it up to him for tricking him. He says he doesn't want anything from her as compensation. She tells him to calm down, that he was talking too much, and that she knows he already examined her thoroughly. He says he'll teach her something, that showing everything had no fun, and that she wouldn't attract anyone that way. She gets embarrassed and says she hadn't thought about that. He starts to leave, and she says she won't be fooled like that. She asks if he looked her up and down. He says maybe a little, and she calls him a pervert. The scene cuts, and he asks why she was drying her hair in his room. She asks if, after talking to the president, he decided to join the council. He says he decided to support the Russian girl for president. She is shocked and says Alya took her brother. He says he wasn't taken. She starts calling him a pervert and asks if he was bewitched by Alya's body. He tells her to stop talking about such things, and she says he needs to open his eyes. She says it's better to have a size C in hand than 2 size E's flying. He says he wasn't interested in either. She starts saying nonsense to him, and he asks why she was thinking such things. She asks if he didn't want to be the first to touch his little sister. Honestly, this anime isn't from God. He tells her not to say such things, and she says he already did it when they were in elementary school. He says he doesn't remember that. The atmosphere gets awkward, and she asks if he forgot. She says in 2nd grade, they bumped into each other while playing tag, and he dove into her thighs. He says he would remember if he had done such a miracle and to stop inventing scenes she sees in her animes. He says at that time she hardly went out because of asthma. She says now she's fine and hasn't caught a cold since the 2nd year of elementary school. He says she could be more relaxed, and she says she is, but only at school and at home. She asks him to pamper her instead of apologizing. He starts brushing her hair, and she asks if he decided to compete with Alya. He says yes and apologizes to her. She says there's no need for him to apologize, that a rivalry between siblings would be classic. He says just to be clear, he hadn't stopped liking her. She says she knows and asks if he still loves her a lot. He indirectly says yes, and she says he admitted it. She stands up and says she didn't need anything else and thanks him. She says now they're rivals and that she's an easy girl who can ignore 1 or 2 episodes of betrayal, and that he can chase after her if he gets tired of the Russian girl. He tells her not to call it betrayal, and that he wouldn't do that. She says she knows that in the end, he'll come back to her. He asks if she became the last cookie in the package, and she says goodbye to him. She closes the door and says now he found someone to motivate him. She laments that unfortunately, it wasn't her who succeeded, but she wouldn't lose by any means. The next day arrives, and he says it's not normal for her not to have invented anything to wake him up, and that maybe she was upset with his decision. He says she wasn't like that, but he had to make it up to her somehow. When he gets up, she pulls his leg. The guy is shocked, and she starts laughing. She tells him if he thinks this will end sadly to think again. He gets mad, and she tries to escape. She asks him to pull her, he smiles and starts suffocating her. He says he will bury her alive, and she says she's going to have a fit with that manly smell. The scene cuts, and the girls were talking about dramas. Meanwhile, Alya was upset because his seat was empty. When she hears a noise at the door, she thinks it's him. She wonders what she was worried about, and that he would come in with a sleepy face as always. She tells herself to stay calm. She hears them greeting cues and is startled. He says good morning to her, and she acts tough. He asks if she was preparing for class. She gets all giddy with his looks, and he asks what the problem was. She says there wasn't any, and she hears a guy inviting him to go to karaoke. While they were talking, she says Q's was different this week. She starts freaking out, wondering what she was thinking, and that he probably didn't get enough sleep as always. As the class goes on, she notices he wasn't falling asleep. The scene cuts, and she wonders if he was improving his behavior for her. She has a flashback of him, then snaps back to reality and makes a great shot, scoring a point for her team. While the girls were praising her, she notices the clueless Q's getting hit in the head with a ball. The scene cuts, and he starts complaining about the pain. He says he was feeling hungry when Alya appears asking if he was okay. He asks why she came, and she says she was worried he got hurt. He says it seems she saw it, and she asks if he wants to go to the infirmary. He says he's fine, that he came to get some fresh air. She gets worried and tries to measure his temperature. She says it's hard to tell like that. He gets a bit shy and starts remembering the size E his sister mentioned. He gets all silly, and she starts tying her hair up. He's enchanted by her beauty and says she must be doing it on purpose. He starts admiring her beauty, and she asks what it is. He says it's nothing, and she leaves, telling him to drink some water. The scene cuts, and they go to drink water. He sees her drinking water and gets all excited. When she looks at him, she asks what he was doing, and he says he needed to cool his head literally. Suddenly, she asks what's wrong with a guy who overflows with charisma from head to toe. He tells her to stay calm, that he was just refreshing himself. She asks if there was something in the sky, and he says he sees clouds. She says he's right and asks why he was stating the obvious. He starts thinking that now he loves gym uniforms. She says he was all wet and asks if he wants a towel. He says he's fine, that he'll let the sun do the work for him. She puts the towel on his head, and he ends up seeing something else. She asks if he's cooler now, and he says now he understands how a dog feels. She asks what breed, and he says he doesn't understand that. He asks her to forgive him for being a stray mutt, and she says naughty dogs have their charms. He gets embarrassed and she pulls him, saying they need to hurry up and for her to go back to class. She says she just got there, he thanks her for the towel, and she says goodbye to him. As they walk, he says he knows where this is going, that they'll call him a pervert. She asks if he's feeling better now and if he doesn't need to cool where it hit. He wonders if she thinks he got wet earlier to cool where the ball hit him. He says he's fine, that there's no bump on his head. She checks and he gets all embarrassed. He wonders why she's being so nice, if she entered a romantic phase. He asks if she isn't being too nice to him. She says he's been different all day, and she was just worried about him. And he starts thinking maybe he hasn't gotten over what happened yesterday. He says there's nothing wrong until his stomach growls, and he says he didn't have breakfast today. She blushes and says she thought he was paying attention in class for once. But in reality, he was just too hungry to sleep. He says he actually had a good night's sleep. She gets mad, saying that while he rested, she couldn't sleep. She stares at him and he asks if she knows what God said. She asks if he's reminding her to love her neighbor. He says Jesus said if someone slaps your cheek, offer the other one too. She stares at him and says that's the look of contempt for a fool who is good for nothing. She walks away, saying she was foolish to worry about him, and she says there's no way she fell in love with this idiot. And he says that's the Aliyah he knows. Later, he asks her to go to the council room together. She stands up angrily, and he thinks maybe he went too far. They see some students bowing. When they go check, they come across her. He says he entered the wrong room, and when he was about to close the door, she stops him. She apologizes and says she thought they were the baseball and football guys. He asks what they did, and she says they ignored her freshmen and there was even a fight, but then she ended up hitting some of them. He says it's an exaggeration to carry a bamboo sword. She says her fists can be lethal, but a sword like that wouldn't kill anyone. He says this is Sarashina, but the boys call her Ane. He tells Q's to chill out and that she didn't commit any violent acts, and that she only used the threat to make sure they would behave. They're all confused, and he says the sight was lovely. She starts hitting him and the guy is laughing, until the girl shows up and asks if she's late. She tells them not to have a romance in the council room, and she says that wasn't what she was thinking. She asks if he's hurt, and he says his shoulders were already hurting, so it was good for him. She says unfortunately she can't control her strength, and he says he was preparing his body to deal with it. They start looking at each other, and Russa tells him to be careful with what he says. He says the boys call her A&E and asks if she wears a band like Sarashina. She asks why he thinks that, and he says if she did, it would be a Sarashina band on Sarashina. She says it seems they get along very well. She plays tough, and he says her sister already noticed. She's in shock, and he says they get along very well. Then someone knocks on the door, and when they check, it's Q's crazy sister. Then the council meeting starts, and he asks Q's to introduce himself. He says he is Q's Masachika, and he will be handling the general affairs of the council, and that next year he and ALYA will be running mates in the presidential election. And it seems like she liked it. He says that his specialty is being an otaku, and that they can talk to him about most of the popular anime that exist. The president says that he is now officially a member of the council. He asks if he could accompany ALYA's sister and help her. The president agrees and says he is sure that he will adapt quickly. After all, he already has experience as vice president. But he still wants him to work with others while learning the basics. He asks if there were not enough people. The president confirms, and Q's perverted sister interrupts, saying she's going to the art club's exhibition. She says that they will definitely discuss the budget. So, in that case, she wants ALYA to accompany her. She gives a fake smile, and ALYA tells the president that she will go. He authorizes them, and they leave quickly, and Q starts thinking that something strange is going to happen. While they were walking, the Russian girl says she should tell her something. She asks if she has a minute to talk. She says yes and suggests they do it in that empty room. Once there, ALYA says she will run for president along with Q's. She says that Q's had already told her, and the Russian girl is impressed. She asks if that's all, and ALYA confirms, adding that she won't apologize because she isn't doing anything wrong. The girl asks again if that's all and tells her to stay calm. After all, she has no reason to apologize. She says that Q's himself decided this, and that she has nothing to say about his decision. She says that the relationship between them won't change anything, but she finds it unfortunate that he didn't choose her. She feels awkward, and when she was about to ask a question, she ends up giving up. She says that she does love Q's, much more than anyone else in this world. She asks if she is serious. She says yes, and that she loves him more than her own parents. She feels embarrassed, and she asks what she thinks of Q's. She feels a bit shy and says that they are friends, and that he is very important to her. She asks if she likes him or if perhaps she is in love with him. She replies that she is not saying that kind of thing. The Russian girl says she just said how much she loves him, and now it's her turn to confess the secret. She says she doesn't know if she is in love, but she won't let her be with him. She mocks her and says she is very pleased to have gotten that information from her. She tells them to go to the art club. She says she heard Masha and Q's calling her by a nickname, and asks if she can call her that too. She says she doesn't mind, and she asks to be called YUKI. She quickly leaves, and she starts thinking that maybe she said something crazy. Then the scene cuts and they were organizing paperwork. Q says that this is for those who know how to work very well. And when he looks back, he finds her all clumsy. The president appears and says he heard about a replacement in the library, and they need people to help. She says she can handle it, and runs off. He apologizes for the mess, and says she's always like that. But she is a great help when there is confusion at school. Q says that everyone has their strengths. She tells them to take a break while she makes tea. He offers to help her, but she says she can handle it alone. She tells him to sit down and that she loves making tea. She asks if he likes tea with milk or tea with jam. He asks if it's the same as in Russia, and in that case, he'll want it. She asks if she can put protein in the president's tea. He says there's nothing good about that, and Q says he didn't expect that kind of joke from her. She smiles at him, and he asks if black tea is a typical winter drink in Russia. She says it depends on the family, and that her family drank tea all year round when they lived there. She says her mother can't live without tea, and he asks if her mother is Japanese. She says it seems like he knows a lot about Russia. He says he watched many Russian movies with his grandfather. He starts thinking, saying that he studied like crazy to learn to talk to his childhood friend. She serves him the tea, and he thanks her. He takes a sip and says it's delicious. She is happy with the compliment, and he says it reminds him a lot of his mother. After all, she was crazy about tea. She puts the jam in her mouth and then takes a sip of the tea. He asks if the jam wasn't supposed to go directly into the tea. She says that's a personal choice, and he tries it, saying it's too sweet. Suddenly the door opens, and they say they've arrived. Masha asks if they would like a cup of tea. She sits next to him, and it seems like she sat too close. She asks what's wrong, and he asks if she isn't too close. She says that in Russia, it's considered bad luck for a young woman to sit at the corner of the table. He asks if that's true, and she says yes. Things get a bit strange, and the atmosphere becomes tense. He asks if something happened between them. He asks Masha if what Alya said is true. She says yes, and that single people who sit at the corner of the table will never get married. She asks Alya if she found someone to marry. She says no, and that she just didn't want to sit there. She asks if she's sure, and Alya plays dumb. She says in Russian that it's too early to get married. Q thinks to himself that they're only 15 years old, and wonders how she can say those things in front of her sister. She hands the jam to Alya, and he is shocked by the amount. She asks what the problem is, and he says it's nothing. Later on, the president says they have issues to discuss with the teachers, and that the freshmen can leave. The scene cuts to them going home. He notices that she seems different and says that his sister must have done something. He calls her and asks what she thinks about stopping somewhere to eat something. She asks why, and he says they need to talk about some things related to the presidential election. She says in Russian that, unfortunately, this isn't a date. And he is shocked, wondering if that's what she wanted. The scene cuts to the Russian girl feeling hungry. She asks what's wrong, and he says it's nothing. She says she's tired and that she needs sugar for her brain to function properly. He asks if something happened between her and his sister. She says no, and he starts wondering what the heck Yuki did. She asks if he and Yuki are dating. He responds with a direct no, and she seems confused. He confirms again that they are not, and when she was about to say what Yuki said, he tells her that he wants to say something to her. He says that she isn't as proper as she seems to be, and that she was having fun mocking her and watching her reactions. He changes the subject and says that at this rate, they won't stand a chance of beating Yuki. She says he sounds very sure. He says it's the truth, and that she is the favorite to be president. He says that normally there would be 3 candidates running for the council. He says that in the past, there were 6 candidates making up 12 people. He says most gave up on the student council. She asks what that is, and he explains that it's a debate among the students. He says that if the baseball and soccer teams hadn't reached an agreement, they would have had to debate in the student council. She says she has seen that happen before, and asks him to explain more about why they gave up. Hughes says that when the council presents the candidates for president, it becomes a preview of the election. And once they debate policies and one side wins, it creates a hierarchy in the eyes of the students. She says she understands, and he says the candidates fight each other until the competition is reduced to 3 candidates. He says that not all candidates join the council, but this year the lack of people is unusual. He says that everyone gave up on defeating Yuki, and she wonders what's going on with him, as it seems he doesn't care about Yuki. While he talks, she wonders if he doesn't think twice before going to a restaurant with a girl. She notices that she ended up biting the straw without realizing it. While he finishes his explanation, she is eating like a lion. He asks if she was paying attention to him. She says she just got distracted by her dessert. She feels shy and says that actually, she was like that because of him. She looks at her dessert and says that since he doesn't care, she will make him care. She asks if he wants some, and he says he doesn't need it. She says she knew he wanted some, and that he doesn't need to be shy. She tells him to open his mouth, and he says he'll get a new spoon. She asks if he's gonna call a waiter just for that. He questions her, and she says that's totally normal in Russia, and tells him to open his mouth. He asks if that's serious, and he realizes she's lying. She tells him to open his mouth, treating him like a baby. He takes a bite and says it was like an indirect kiss. While everyone is watching them, he ends up facing a girl. She asks how they will defeat Yuki, and he says that facing her directly won't work. In that case, they will need to run a campaign attracting students. He says that one of last year's candidates was a former president, and yet it was the current president who won. He says he won thanks to his well-developed strategy. The journalism club made a profile on him because they found the idea of him running for president amusing. He says that after his appearance changed and his grades improved, he started gaining everyone's trust. She asks if she needs a good story to show the students how much she is working to help them. He starts thinking thinking and asks what she will do with that spoon. And coincidentally, she is thinking the same thing. They start running out of topics, and Q's asks if she minds if he orders something. The scene cuts and the waitress delivers the food and the extra spoon to him. She says he didn't need to ask for another spoon, and he says he was embarrassed. She says he is too childish to be embarrassed by something so trivial, and she thought he was used to girls by now. He says he was surprised that sharing a spoon was something normal for her. He asks if indirect kisses are normal in Russia, and she says in Russian that he is the only guy she would do that with. He tells her to eat before it melts, and she asks how she can build support like the president did. He says she needs to show her effort to everyone. She asks if he was referring to the speech, and he says that would be the first political speech for everyone. She asks what she should say in her first speech, and he tells her to do whatever she wants. After talking a bit more, she asks if there isn't a specific counsel for that. He says she doesn't need to pretend, and that she is a captivating person as she is. She feels very shy and says in Russian that she wants more compliments. He says that for a casual restaurant, this place is really good. She asks if it was really good, and he says yes. He asks if she wants some, but then remembers that the food was too spicy for her. She says if she refuses, he'll find out she doesn't like spicy food. She says she'll just have a spoon. He takes a whole chili with the spoon, and his sister's little devil appears, encouraging him to do something wrong. Then Masha appears and asks him not to be mean to her. She hits Masha, and she flies away. He apologizes and hands it to her. She prepares herself and puts the whole spoonful in her mouth. She starts freaking out and calls him an idiot in Russian. As night falls, he asks if she's okay. She plays dumb, and he pretends not to know anything. She says that if he is with her, Yuki will find a running mate. He says she is quite popular, so it wouldn't make a difference who she chooses, unless it was someone who had been part of the student council. He says they would be in trouble if she chooses someone like Taniyama. She asks who that person is, and he says she was a strong competitor against Yuki in the elections they won. She says she doesn't know her, and he wonders if she has given up on being president. He starts to slack off, and she asks what's wrong. He says they will soon find out who will be her partner. Then the next day arrives, and she says she will introduce someone to them. Hughes is shocked, and she introduces herself as Kimishina Ayano from the first year, Class C. And from today, she will be part of the council. Hughes didn't like the news, and she makes a mocking face. She tells Hughes that they will do their best, and the atmosphere becomes very tense. Until the scene cuts and Hughes was heading to the classroom. He hears a voice calling him, and when he turns around, it's Ayano. He asks if she needs anything, and she apologizes for scaring him. She asks if he has a minute, and then tells him to follow her. As they walk, Hughes says she looks like some kind of ninja, until the scene cuts again, and he tells her to get to the point. She says she heard he was planning to run for president against the Russian girl. She asks if it's true, and he says yes. She says that her master was very dissatisfied with this unexpected turn of events, and that he didn't like knowing Hughes was in the way after abandoning the SEUS family name. He calls the old man a bastard, and says that the old man said if he left, they'd be strangers, and that he wouldn't be allowed to be called Yuki's brother, so why did he want to talk about family now? He asks if he sent her to check if it was true. She says no, and that she was asking on her own. After all, as Yuki's assistant, it's her duty to assess any threat to her. He says she's very loyal, and asks if she's a samurai. She says she always thought he wouldn't do anything to hurt his own sister. She asks if she was wrong, and he says he didn't do it to compete with YUKI. She says it doesn't matter, and that they are rivals. She asks if running with the Russian girl is so important that he'd hurt his own sister. He says yes, and she's impressed. He says he promised her he'd do everything to make her president. She asks if he feels something special for her. He says no, that it was his own decision. He asks her to leave a message for that old man, to not bother YUKI, and if he wants to say something, he should say it to his face. She says she understood, and that she'll ask him one last question. She asks if he still loves his sister the same way. He says his sister is still the most important person in the world to him. He asks her to support her, and she says she's happy to hear those words from him. She leaves quickly, and he says he might have disappointed her, until the scene cuts and the guy was holding a magazine in his hand. He asks which one Hughes likes the most, and he says he doesn't understand much about these things. He tells him to choose based on appearance, and he says in that case he'd choose this one. The guy says the one he chose looks a lot like Masha. They go to check, and the guy says it really does. He asks if he likes girls like her, and he says she already has a boyfriend. He asks if she didn't have one, would he go after her? He asks since when he calls her by a nickname. He says it happened suddenly, and that he never looked at her that way, until the mood changes, and she calls him an animal in Russian. She asks if he thinks it's acceptable for a council representative to bring this to school. He says it wasn't him who brought it, that it was this guy here. She says he has to reprimand him, and it seems she got jealous. He changes the subject, and asks if he'd date YUKI. He says he's reprimanded in the name of Jesus, and the guy asks why. He says he wants a girlfriend who's his best friend. She asks in Russian if it would be her, and the guy got embarrassed. He asks what the problem was, and he says it was nothing. He remembers his childhood friend, and says he wanted a girl with a nice smile. He says it's true and that it's hard to like someone with cold eyes. He says everyday behavior is also important. She gets the hints, and he tells them the Russian girl was getting upset. She acts tough and says in Russian that she doesn't care about that. He tells them to say something nice to her. The guy stands up and says it doesn't matter if it's a pretty girl like Lya. They say he wasn't helping, and she apologizes if she only has beauty and no charm. He tries to justify himself, but he's shaking. She takes the magazine and says she'll confiscate it, and it seems the guy got sad. Until the scene cuts and Ayano was saying that Hughes was still the man she idolized. She asks what he said, and she says he refused to give up supporting the Russian girl in this election. She says he asked her to tell the master to come speak to him in person. She's impressed, and says those words were sincere. She says his fantastic aggressiveness caused shockwaves in her womb. She's shocked and asks if she's in love with him. She says she idolizes him, but there are no romantic feelings involved. She says she'd never dare to try to date him, and all she wants is to be a tool for him. She says she's a submissive and asks what she meant by that. She says she's a super maid serving a boss. She thanks her for the explanation and says she'll dedicate herself to being the perfect submissive. She didn't like what she heard, and says that Q's also said she was the most important person in the world to him. She's surprised and runs to the window. She's relieved, and says she almost shouted her love for him in the middle of school. She says her brother is too cute, but since he wants to face her, things are going to get interesting. She says she never thought ALYA would be a problem for her, and she says that most first-year students believe in her victory. But as for the Russian girl, they think she's a transfer student making a mess by challenging someone who was already president. She starts laughing and says they're ruthless. She asks how Q's is going to turn the situation around, and she says it looks like she's having fun. She says she's finally going to face the greatest talent ever to come out of the SEUS family. She says she's never been able to surpass him in anything, and now he's coming for her with ALYA. She says they can come, and she'll face them with everything she has. She calls her and she asks what it is, and she asks if she doesn't look like a final boss. Until later, and the girls were playing Uno for a KIT. The Russian girl ends up giving up, and she says she had nothing and was just bluffing. She's impressed, and Masha says it's a shame. She takes the chocolates and she gets mad. She starts dealing the cards, and the president says YUKI was getting the upper hand. He says it's a battle of intelligence, and YUKI is good at it. She says she feels it's easy being the Russian girl, and he says he was trying not to say that out loud. She apologizes, and the Russian girl was in shock. The president says she doesn't look like she's bluffing, and he thought it would be easier for her. But as for her sister, you can't tell what she's thinking. Q says she has her own special energy, and she asks if she's not stupid, and he says he was trying not to say that. The girl appears behind her and asks if she wants more. She says yes, and that she caught her by surprise. Q says he doesn't need it and that he still has some. He says she behaves strangely, and if she learned that from being SEU's assistant. She says yes, and that her grandparents taught her. Q says her grandparents served Yuki's family. She says her parents are office workers, and she chose this option because she admires her grandparents. She asks how long she's been doing it. She says there wasn't a specific date, but she's been doing it since the 2nd grade. She asks if it wasn't too early, and she says it was out of admiration for her grandparents. When she was about to talk about Q's, she corrects herself and says it's good to serve YUKI. Q's gets angry and asks to talk to her. She apologizes to him, and he tells her not to let it slip again. He looks into her eyes and wonders why they show respect and love instead of being angry at him. He asks if making a sound is a necessary skill for an attendant. She says her grandparents already taught her that, and that a servant should never stand out. She starts having a flashback of when she was a child. And honestly, at that age, I was watching cartoons on TV. Until Masha appears and asks her for a drink. While they were playing, she says ALYA told her to shut up and leave. The president says he's worried they'll fight. Hughes says it's no problem, and that she was having fun. Masha says she was spreading her wings. He agrees with her, and she asks if he noticed. He says yes, and they wonder if she was really having fun. She pours the rest into the glass, and she says she'll bring more drinks. She says she's going, and she says she was the heroine of the day. Hughes says that this welcome party was for them, and that it made her the heroine. She calls him a hero and asks if he can show the way. He says he's gonna buy drinks and asks if she wants anything. She says she wants a coffee with milk, but with more coffee. The Russian girl says she wants an ashiruko. He orders a cider and she orders a cola soda. Ayano asks for water, and she says she wants lemon tea. He tells her she doesn't need to ask since she's going with him. They start walking and she thanks him. He asks why, and she says it's for him offering to compete with ALYA. She says she knows the Russian girl was happy, and he says she doesn't need to thank him for that. She disagrees and says that ALYA never had anyone to rely on, and that she was happy he was by her side. He asks if she was perhaps hiding her responsible side from ALYA. She gets embarrassed and says she doesn't want to compete with her. She says ALYA puts a lot of effort into everything she does. She starts having a flashback about them and says that's why she loves her so much. He asks if that's why she acts like a carefree sister. She says she wasn't pretending anything, and that living life with tense shoulders gets tiring. But nevertheless, she tries to be more relaxed around ALYA. While he's getting the drinks, she says she doesn't want her sister to feel isolated. She says sibling relationships are difficult. She says they are too close, which leads to comparisons and competitions. He starts thinking and says he understands that so much it hurts. He says he doesn't feel inferior to her only because she always shows her love and admiration for him. He starts wondering if she was intentionally using an otaku personality. But he knew she was genuinely like that. He says she's a very caring older sister. She says she's actually a great sister but asks him to keep that a secret. He asks why he would say that, and that she probably wouldn't believe him. She says he acts as if he's not hiding a responsible side. He says unlike her, he doesn't have a reason to. He says he only plays the lazy role to relax and not have people depend on him. She smiles and starts patting his head. She says he's trying hard and that everything will be okay. He gets shy and she says he's a good boy, and he starts wondering why he gets so soft around her. Then the scene cuts and someone calls the Russian girl. And when she looks, it's Taniyama from Class F. She calls her over to talk, and ALYA remembers the information Q's gave her. She asks if it's true that she's running with Q's in the presidential election. She replies yes, and she asks if she has no shame in doing that. She says she stole the running mate that YUKI had in mind, and if it was to upset her. She asks if she's implying she did something dishonest to have Q's on her side. While everyone was following the drama, she says it doesn't matter how she did it. But she chose a lazy person to be her running mate. And that can only mean she was trying to provoke Yuki. Q's shows up and runs to them. He asks what's going on, and she says this bitch is accusing her of doing something to steal him from Yuki. He says he doesn't know what she heard or from whom, but that was his own decision. She says it's hard to believe that, and that he's been slacking off for a while, and what would motivate him to team up with a new transfer student. He says he can't deny his laziness, but anyway, Yuki had already accepted his decision. He says she got everything wrong and should apologize to Alya. She mocks him and says the problem was with him. She starts getting closer to him and challenges him to a student congress. While the drama was unfolding, the students were spreading the gossip to everyone. He asks if she's serious and she asks why she would joke about that. She says someone like him doesn't deserve a place in the selection, or better yet, in any place on the student council. She says she heard this could establish a hierarchy and for her to stop ignoring her presence. She tells her not to get involved and that she's just a puppet with good grades. She gets scared and says they're running as a team, and in that case she'll have to go over her too. She says she was trying to spare her from the embarrassment, but in that case she'll take them both down at once, and that people like them don't deserve to run in this election. That's it, my friends. The video ends here. If you like this Russian girl anime, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, so you will be notified when the next episode comes out, okay? Thanks for watching, we're together, and see you next time.